All right, so my mic was muted. Trust me, this kind of stuff happens when we do the weekly live lessons as well. So I'll repeat what I just said. What we're doing here is we're in the middle of a live lesson series, which is part of the membership program over at thevirtualinstructor.com. And right now we're combining alcohol-based markers with colored pencils to create a wonderful little drawing of a frog. And since we're in the middle of this live lesson series right now, there are times when we have to do a little bit of homework in between, which means that we might come across a point in the drawing process or the painting process where we come across a kind of a tedious activity where we have to repeat a process over and over again. That's what I'm going to be working on for you guys today, and hopefully you'll pick up a thing or two here. If you want to watch more of our live lessons, which are part of our membership program at thevirtualinstructor.com, just head over to thevirtualinstructor.com/members, and there you can learn more about our membership program. And of course, you can access all of our recorded live lessons. We have over 250 recorded live lessons, of course, along with our great video courses, ebooks, lesson plans, and weekly critiques, and everything that we offer over there. Anyway, if you want to learn more, just click on the link below. That's what I said just a minute ago. Now let's try to switch back over here again. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. The mic is unmuted. Those things happen. So I see all those, it looks like angry faces and then smiley faces all over the place here in the chat box. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. It's a little bit laid back here. So let's try again to jump back into this one. All right, so here is our frog. And anyway, what we've been doing up to this point is, like I said, we've created a marker underpainting, and then over the top we're applying colored pencil applications to build up the intensity of the color, to increase the contrast, to develop the details. And markers and colored pencils, alcohol-based markers specifically, and colored pencils work extremely well together. You can see the results that we're getting here. And of course you can get these results with colored pencils on their own, but you really can't get results like this with markers on their own. But with colored pencils, if you were to take this approach with just colored pencils without markers, it would take a little bit more time than what it's taken us to develop the depth and the color here and the range of value and all the details and the texture. But by combining the markers with the colored pencil applications, we save a little bit of time. We create a nice marker underpainting. As you can see, this area right here has not been developed yet. And that's what we're going to be working on here. I'm working on Canson marker paper. I love Canson papers, and the marker paper is inexpensive, but it's a pretty high quality marker paper. Marker paper is a little bit different than regular drawing paper, or perhaps the drawing paper that you might be accustomed to. The marker paper is very, very smooth. It's semi-translucent. That's why I've attached it to a piece of Bristol paper underneath. You can see that up here. That kind of helps eradicate some of the translucency. And there is a limited amount of layers of colored pencils that you can apply to this paper, clearly because the tooth or texture of the paper is not quite as strong as what you find with other drawing papers, which the heavier the tooth is, or the more coarse or rough the texture is, the more layers of colored pencil material that you can apply to the surface. Of course, if you work on regular drawing paper, when you're applying the marker applications, you're not going to have the same effect as what we're getting here. So that's why we're working on the marker paper here. And hopefully I can provide some insight for you with this particular process. This is a combination of material that I really love, and the process is something that I really love as well. Anyway, we're using alcohol-based markers, or we did use alcohol-based markers to apply the underpainting here. And you can see here's one of the alcohol-based markers that I use. These are by Prismacolor. These are Premier markers. They are a little bit pricier than traditional water-based markers, but alcohol-based markers are quite different from water-based markers in that they have a bit of translucency associated with them. So you can apply them in the layers much like you can watercolor paint to build up a bit of value and gradually increase the intensity of the color. And like I said, they work well with colored pencil applications that we can apply over the top. I'm also using Prismacolor Premier colored pencils. These are softer colored pencils, and they layer really nicely. They build up to kind of create a buttery surface, and the result of that is we get kind of a more painterly look to our final image. So now, I like Prismacolor Premier pencils. I know not everybody likes them because they are so soft that they break a little bit easily, but I think the trade-off is substantial here with the results that you can get with the Prismacolor Premier pencils. And I should note that the Prismacolor Premier pencils are the softer version of the pencils, if I didn't mention that already, compared to the very thin pencil line that they also produce, which has harder lead inside of it, which is not going to get you the exact same results that we're seeing here. So anyway, we're kind of following an order of the way we're applying the pencils. We're trying to stay consistent. We started up here and clearly we're working our way back. There's about 5 or 6 different pencils that I'm using to build up the texture here. And we're going to be continuing this live lesson series tonight for the members at thevirtualinstructor.com. And up to this point, we have gone through 7 lessons, 7 one-hour lessons to arrive at this point. We drew everything out with graphite first with a light graphite pencil. Then we created the marker underpainting, and now we're at the stage where we're applying the colored pencils over the top. And I also should point out that the photo reference that I'm using here is from pixabay.com, which is a wonderful site to find images here. All right, so I'm going to start here with a bit of green ochre, and you can see in these areas I've already started to apply some of the green ochre to build up the texture. The way to create the illusion of texture in any drawing or painting, really the key is all based on the relationship of values, and value is the darkness or lightness of a color. So we understand texture based on the relationships of value. For example, we can see that there's a bumpy texture right here because we've got dark and light values that are positioned next to each other. And of course, the light values are areas that are picking up light, and the dark values are the areas in between where we have some shadow. And because of that, we understand that this texture right here is the way that it is. Here we see a little bit of a different texture. There's a smoother texture here because there's not quite as much contrast going on in the different values here. Of course, the directional strokes that we make with the pencil is important as well, but really value is the key to creating a lot of illusions in our drawings and paintings. And of course, when we're working with colored pencils, that is no different. So I'm starting here with the green ochre, and I'm just going to start working my way back. Again, I'm starting with kind of lighter marks here, and we don't have to copy the texture of the frog exactly. In fact, we probably should never try to copy a photo reference exactly. One of the wonderful things about looking at drawings and paintings is being able to see what I like to call the hand of the artist, and that is the way that the artist has decided to make marks on the surface. And sometimes if we're trying to copy a photograph exactly, we kind of lose that individual touch that we can create in a drawing or a painting because we're trying to copy everything exactly. And not to mention that if you did try to copy everything exactly from a photo reference, exactly the way it is, it really takes a lot of the joy out of creating art. It becomes kind of a process that's not quite as fun. You tend to tighten up a little bit, and that's never good. So we're gonna deviate a little bit from the photo reference and let that happen. We're still trying to create the illusion of texture clearly. So we're taking cues from the photo reference and using them to create the illusion of texture in the drawing. So even though we're not copying the photo reference exactly, we are still trying to replicate the texture that we see. And as long as we get the value relationships right, if the bump that I'm drawing here is in a little bit of a different place than what it is in the photo reference, that's okay. We're still going to create the illusion that we're after here. And I see that there's a lot of comments in the chat box here on YouTube. I'll do my very best to lift my head up and address those every once in a while. If you do have a question directed at me, or the process that I'm using here, anything that you want to ask, you're free to ask. Again, this is just me completing a little bit of work before we go into tonight's live lesson, which again is part of our membership program. So if you like this kind of stuff, you ought to check out the membership program. I do occasionally stream here on YouTube, but as you can see, as we started things off here, the mic wasn't muted, and that kind of made things all a little bit crazy, but that's what happens with live stuff anyway. We've been streaming live at the Virtual Instructor since 2012, so we've been doing it for a while over there, and there's always little technical things that happen. So as I'm working my way down here to this dark spot that happens right here, I notice that the texture starts to smooth out a little bit. And because the texture is going to smooth out a little bit, we're going to see less contrast in the value. There's going to be more of a smooth transition or a slow change from dark to light. And the color is going to be a little bit more consistent. And you can play up the amount of texture that you want to create by simply increasing the contrast, especially with these bumps. So if you want to make the values a little bit darker in the shadowed areas and the values a little bit lighter in the highlighted areas, you're going to create the impression that the texture is a little bit stronger or more pronounced than it is here in the photo reference. And vice versa. If you want to make the texture a little bit more subtle, of course, you would just kind of back off the contrast a little bit. So I'm going to work my way back to about right here in this live stream, and then stop there. But we're going to address these spots too. And with the spots, we're not going to use black, although it may look like black. But I'll wait and tell you what colors we're going to use there. But it's not black. It's actually a combination of colors. In fact, no black has been used in this drawing at all. And whenever I do create a colored drawing like this, especially with colored pencils, I tend to steer away from black. And that's because black is such a very, very strong color. It can tend to make a drawing look flat and unnatural. And maybe you've noticed that in your own colored pencil drawings. If you're kind of plugging along and then you pick up the black colored pencil and you add it, and it may look unnatural. And that's because in reality, we don't really see things that are black. We see dark grays, and we really don't see white either. We see light, really, really light values. But white is not quite as strong as black. So using pure white in your drawings and paintings is really not that big of a deal. But if you use too much of it, it is. But black, on the other hand, is such a strong color. So you can see as I'm working back here on this little hump that happens right here, our light source is originating from the upper right-hand corner. So this means most of the highlights are going to exist on the top part here. But as we start to get back on the back side of the body, you can notice that the values get quite a bit darker. And also the texture is not quite as pronounced. So I'm not leaving as many light areas in between with this particular application of the green ochre. Now, of course, there are some textural things that happen in those little black spots too, and we'll address those too. I am following a particular order when I'm applying these colored pencils, and this is just kind of the order that I started with over here. And I've kind of kept these pencils out in front of me in that same order so I can repeat that order. The order that you apply the colored pencils is going to affect the color that's perceived here. So you want to, if you kind of come up with a way to apply the colored pencils, in order to apply the colored pencils with specific colors, then you probably need to stick with it as much as possible as you continue through the drawing, because you want to make sure that everything stays fairly consistent. And this is kind of a medium to light application. I'm not applying very heavy pressure at this point with the green ochre pencil. And we've got some lighter greens that are starting to emerge down here as well. So for right now, I'll stop with the green ochre pencil, and then I'm going to switch over to a white. And the reason why I'm switching over to the white is we want to establish some of the highlights before we start developing some of the darker tones and values that happen here, because it's a whole lot easier to apply darker values over the top of applications than it is to apply lighter applications over the top of darker values. So that's why we're going with the white next. And there are some pretty strong highlights in here. Some of the really strong highlights, we're going to go back at the end of this with a bit of gouache to make those highlights really strong. And what gouache is opaque watercolor. And gouache is used, it can be used on its own to create fantastic drawing or paintings, but it can also be used to enhance images. And in this case, we're probably going to use a little bit of gouache to go back and add those highlights, those strong highlights. The gouache will go right over the top of the colored pencil applications without issue. And you can see the white here doesn't cover up everything completely. Some of that color still shows through. Go up here and get some of these little small bumps where we still have some of those strong highlights. So at the end, we'll be using the gouache in just a couple of areas. So it goes without saying here that even though we've created a marker underpainting and we're developing the colored pencil applications over the top, and even though we're saving time with this process by doing so, this still is a process that requires some patience. You have to work deliberately and a little bit slowly in order to create results that are representational and realistic. I think a lot of times we get so wrapped up in wanting things to happen quickly, and that's just not the way it is with the most art materials. So of course, there are some drawings and paintings that you can create relatively quickly and find a level of success with, but I think a lot of folks are disillusioned with the fact that it's the reason why people can draw certain things or produce certain types of artworks is because they are just born with some mysterious talent that some people have and some people don't. And people who are working artists and have found some success in the art world know that that's not really the case. Instead, drawing and painting are skills that really anyone can learn and develop. It's just like any other skill. You have to be taught how everything works, basically. And then there's a lot of practice involved and a lot of patience as well. But really, if you're interested in drawing and painting and being an artist, don't let anybody tell you that you have to have some mysterious talent to do so. You can learn how to draw and paint, and you can learn how to draw and paint at a high level. And I've had thousands and thousands of students over the years, and I have seen this over and over again with students that I've taught. They may come in not very talented, so to speak, but they're willing to learn, and they're willing to listen and practice and work hard. And as a result, they see good results, and eventually people start calling them talented, even though it's due to their hard work and perseverance. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that kind of stuff. They like to continue to use the excuse of talent. They like to say, well, I'm just not talented. I wish I was talented. I wish I could do that. And the truth of the matter is they could do that if they wanted to. It's just they're not really interested in learning how to be an artist or to create art in a certain way. And they just don't really want to put the hard work in, and that's no problem. If you think about all the things that you've done in life that are worthwhile, the things that you're proud of, the things that you want to show other people about yourself, they're usually the things that require hard work and perseverance, and drawing and painting are no different. Now you can imagine that if we just had applied these two pencils, the green ochre and the white, to a plain white sheet of paper, we wouldn't be getting the results that we're getting here. So clearly the underpainting that we created with the alcohol-based markers is working for us exceptionally well here, because clearly some of those colors are showing through and affecting the results that we're getting with just these two colored pencils. And I absolutely love this combination of media. As I mentioned before, there are a few videos here on YouTube that I've published on YouTube combining markers and colored pencils like this. All right, once we've got some of the white applications in place and we've kind of preserved some of those highlights, next thing we're going to do is we're going to start bringing in some of the greens that we applied up here. And I kind of like to stick with a base color that I'll use throughout drawing or painting. And that adds some consistency, and it also creates a bit of harmony and unity in a drawing or painting. So I'm going to switch over here to the color that I'm using for my base color, which is apple green. And I'm going to bring some of this color over here, and I'm going to kind of work in the mid-tone areas. And as we begin to apply these colors, now that this is kind of our third color that we've added, the colored pencils will start to mix together a little bit and start to build up a little bit of a waxy layer. And this is going to allow us to do some mixing on the surface. And the more wax that we get on the surface built up by these colored pencil applications, the more the colored pencil applications start to behave a little bit more like paint. We can't really move the color around on the surface that much, but we can move it around a little bit. And the drawing starts to take on an appearance more so to that of a painting. And as I mentioned before, these are wax-based colored pencils. Most of the colored pencils that you will encounter are indeed wax-based colored pencils, but there are oil-based colored pencils out there as well. Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils are wax-based, or oil-based, I should say. Those are probably the most popular brand out there that are oil-based pencils. So oil-based pencils are going to behave a little bit differently than these wax-based pencils. Let's get a couple more highlights in here. You'll still be able to layer them, but you can't build up a waxy surface with oil-based colored pencils, clearly, because they have oil as a binder as opposed to wax as a binder. So you still can layer them and build up color and build up depth, but they're really better suited, the oil-based pencils are really better suited for kind of light layered applications instead of heavier applications like we're applying here with the wax-based colored pencils. So I'm just bringing in some of this apple green, as I mentioned before, to make sure that we have some consistency with the colors up here. And it might not seem like there's a big difference made at this point, but that little bit of color will add consistency. To our drawing. And I kind of like to work this way. You can see I'm kind of working in sections as I'm working my way back. And not everybody's going to like to do that. Some people like to apply all the colors that they're going to apply at one time and kind of finish the drawing all in several different layers. I prefer to work in little sections because I feel like it gives me little wins along the way. It gives me a little bit of encouragement to keep going as I finish each little section. All right, the next color we're gonna go to is actually the kelp green. But before we do that, let's go ahead and just preserve a few areas where we've got some areas of lighter value, more of a yellow-green showing up around these dark spots. And for this, I'm going to use a little bit of chartreuse. I forgot to point out, but I should point out here that I've changed the colors a little bit. You might have noticed that. the colors that I'm using from the reference photo. And the reason why I'm doing that is because the greens in the reference photo are a little bit of a minty green. They have a little bit of blue in them. And as a result, I feel like the colors that we observe in the photo reference when placed in a drawing like this would almost look a little bit unnatural. And that's why I've changed the colors a little bit and made them a little bit more yellow-green, because I feel like that appears a little bit more natural. There's a lot of times when we're working on a drawing or painting and we're working from a photo reference, and sometimes the information that we get from a photo reference is not always the best information to use for a drawing. And I think this is one of those examples, dealing with speaking about the minty green. If we would have used the minty green that's very similar to what we see in the photo reference, it might make the frog look a little bit unnatural. So I just made that decision. All right, next we're going to use a little bit of kelp green, and this kelp green is a little bit darker. It's a little bit more of a blue green. All green has blue and yellow in it, clearly. And some greens lean a little bit more to the bluer side of things, and some greens lean a little bit more to the yellow side of things. And this kelp green leans a little bit more to the bluer side of things. So we're going to be using it mostly in the darker areas. But again, this is the same color that we've used for the other areas, and it will add a little bit of consistency. So as I'm adding this kelp green, I'm going to add it mostly in the areas of darker value or shadow in between these bumps. We can see that texture start to develop here. And then we're going to get progressively darker even still. So we kind of started with the lighter, we started with the green ochre, which is kind of a darker value, but that green ochre kind of helped to frame each one of these little bumps that happen here. And now we're starting to get a little bit darker, and we're going to keep getting darker and darker and darker. So basically, once we've got these little bumps established on here, then we can go in and start making things a little bit darker and increasing the contrast clearly. You might notice also that the tooth of the texture or the tooth of the paper is still a bit evident here, and the tooth of the paper is the texture of the paper. So as I'm applying the colored pencil applications, you'll still see some grittiness or graininess on the surface. And as we add additional colored pencil applications, it'll start to be a little bit smoother like we see here. So let's zoom in a little bit closer so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about. You get a better idea of the texture that we're creating here too. So you can see here with just a couple applications how grainy the surface still looks. But here we've got a little bit more of the applications on the surface. We can see that we're kind of creating a little bit more of a smoother appearance. And I'm speaking specifically to the texture of the paper itself. So not necessarily the texture of the bumpiness we're creating here on the back of the frog, but more the texture of the paper. And of course, if you want to hurry that process up, you can use a colorless blender, which we've got here as well, which we may use. We've used it in several areas at this point already. So back here on the back side of this little rump, I'll call it, we'll add a generous portion of this kelp green since it is darker. And we're going to be pushing these values much darker as well. Again, since our light source is originating from the upper right-hand corner, this is producing darker values on the back side of the frog. Again, patience is so important. And if you're having trouble developing patience to create a drawing like this, then it might be a good idea to do a little exercise And that exercise is just to find some reference material, whether it's a photo reference or something that you're actually looking at from life, and spend a good amount of time just addressing a very, very small area. Like, for example, you may tell yourself, I'm going to spend an hour and draw just in a 2-inch by 2-inch section on my drawing paper. And I'm going to spend an hour on that. And then focus in on a certain area within a photo reference. And really concentrate on what you're seeing. You hear that all the time, just draw what you see and all that stuff. And that's great advice. And that's what I encourage you to do. But a lot of times people just don't know what to look for. You know, if you've been told to draw what you see, and you might be looking at an image like this and say, oh, it's a frog, I'll draw a frog. That makes perfect sense, right? But in reality, what we mean by draw what you see is you're drawing the elements of art that you see. You're drawing the lines that you see, the shapes that you see, the textures that you see, the colors that you see, and so on. And for a lot of people, that's kind of a hard concept to grasp. But that's basically what we're doing here. The way we're creating this illusion is I'm just paying attention to the values that I see in the reference, and I'm trying to copy them in a similar way than what it's perceived in the reference photo. And as a result, we create an illusion that looks like something from reality. All right, the next color I'm going to use here is lime peel. And again, this is just a color that we've used over here, and I'm just continuing to use it over here. I'm going to use this in spots. It's not going to be real evident, but it will help to harmonize the piece a little bit. So I'm going to use it mainly on the back side of some of these highlights. It'll help to tone down some of the highlights a little bit and make them appear a little bit more natural. It'll soften the texture just a bit, because we do want it to be softened just a bit. It doesn't need to be quite as strong as it is. And with colored pencils too, I've noticed that a lot of folks just add a couple colors and call it a day, and then wonder why their drawings are not very representational looking, not very realistic looking, and it's usually because they just haven't put in the time and they haven't layered enough colors. So that's another way that you can improve your drawings, your colored pencil drawings specifically, is try applying more colors to build up the depth in the color. Don't try to look for a specific color that matches perfectly, because you're usually not going to find that. Usually it's a combination of colors that leads to a more believable illusion. All right, now we're ready to increase the contrast, and when we increase the contrast here, the texture is going to really pop out. So I kind of like what's happening right here. So I'm going to not necessarily increase the contrast too much here, but I am going to increase it just a little bit. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to combine a couple of pencils, and the two pencils we're going to combine are indigo blue and dark umber. Now, dark umber is a dark brown and indigo blue is a dark blue. Clearly, these two pencils combine to make a wonderful black, and these are the colors that we've used here. Now you'll notice that the black that's here has a little bit of a cooler feel associated with it. If you look real close, it almost looks like a dark blue, and that's because we're allowing the indigo blue to dominate the mixture there. But in some of these wrinkles and some of the other areas, there's a little bit of the blue showing through, but more so the dark umber, and that's because we want these shadows to have a little bit more of a warmer feel, because they're closer related to the darker greens that are happening here. And these greens, of course, are yellow greens, so they're warmer, so we're going to allow the dark umber to dominate. Now, the way to create a black and allow one of the colors to dominate is we're going to start with the color that we want to dominate. So if we want to create more of a warmer, darker tone or a black, then we would start with the dark umber. If we wanted to create a cooler black, we'd start with the indigo blue. So we're going to start here with the dark umber, and I'm just going to start reinforcing some of these shadowed areas. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to go too too heavy with the contrast here because I don't want to make these bumps stand out too much. I want them to be there, and we can build up the texture as much as we want by increasing the contrast and make these bumps appear as strong as we want them to be, again, by increasing the contrast, but we don't want them to be too strong, especially in this area where I feel like the texture is reading pretty nicely right now. So I'm still not putting very heavy pressure here. It's still kind of a lighter touch. And if you look closely, you can really see the differences between what I'm drawing here and what's going on in the photo reference. There are some subtle differences. There are some not so subtle differences as well. But, you know, no one's going to see the reference that we used when we're finished with the drawing. That's not something that you normally see. I know a lot of people like to show the reference that they drew from as and kind of have that as some kind of prize on how much they match the photo reference. But in reality, in most circumstances, people aren't going to see the reference that you used, nor do they really care about the reference that you use. They're more interested in the final result of the artwork that you create. So, you know, you can deviate from your reference. You can deviate from your subject that you're looking at from reality. What ultimately matters is the end result of your artwork. And as long as you can create an adequate illusion in your drawings, then that's really all that matters. So I'm using a little bit more of the heavy, or a little bit more of the dark umber back here, with a little bit of a heavier application because we know that that area is shadowed. And I will continue on with this, not here on the stream, but later on here, again, as we continue with this live lesson series tonight. And we'll be continuing with it next week as well. So you can see there's kind of a darker strip that happens right here, a little bit of a darker green. So I'm applying a little bit more of the dark umber here too. And as I'm applying this, I'm using mostly circular strokes to apply the material. This kind of creates a more even application. And as you go, if you want to tone down some of the bumps a little bit, make them look a little bit less pronounced, you can do so by just kind of going over the top of them lightly with the dark umber. But you can see how this texture is created very clearly through the contrast of value and just slowly building up these applications. We've almost lost those dark spots, but we'll go back and add them in just a minute. You can see how warm these shadows appear with just the dark umber. And in a lot of areas here, the dark umber alone creates a nice bit of contrast. All right, next we're going to cool them down just a little bit and add a little bit of the indigo blue here. And the indigo blue, again, is going to cool down the shadows a little bit. It's going to mix with the dark umber and create more of a natural darker tone. But we're still going to allow that dark umber to dominate in most areas because we want, for the most part, we want these shadowed areas to appear a little bit warmer. But you can also see how that indigo blue creates more of a green as well. Just have to be patient. You know, people rush through so many pieces of artwork these days. And I think it's because we're kind of just accustomed to getting everything quickly and fast and got to get it now and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, if we just slow down, We just slow down, it makes such a huge difference. It really does. And you can be successful a lot of times just by slowing down a little bit. See how natural that shadow looks now? We're likely going to go in and burnish some of these applications. Now I need to go up here too because I haven't really applied too much of this indigo blue to this little section up here, which I already had in place for the most part with a bit of the dark umber. And we'll use the colorless blender in just a minute and really make this look a little bit more realistic because we can still see the graininess. You can see here. You can see the graininess of the paper here, but you can't see it here. And that's because we've really worked in the colored pencil applications here with the colorless blender. And here we haven't done that yet. So that colorless blender is just a colored pencil without any pigment in it. So it's just the wax material void of the color, and that extra wax will allow the pencil to be moved, or the pigment on the surface to be moved around, and it'll allow it to mix and all that good stuff. Now, if you do get some areas of shadow that become a little bit too cool, and you want to warm them back up, logically the only thing you need to do is apply a little bit more of the dark umber over the top. So we might have some of those areas where a little bit more of the blue is dominating in areas that we don't want it to. Just a little bit of dark umber there usually does the trick. So you'll remember a few minutes ago we added a little bit of that chartreuse color around that spot. You probably didn't even really notice it when we applied it because the values were so similar. But as we're darkening the values around that section, you can see that it starts to stand out a little bit, and that's because value or contrast in value is relative. So we can make a value appear darker by applying lighter values around it or developing lighter values around it, and vice versa. We can make a value appear light or darker by putting lighter values around it, and vice versa. We can make a value appear lighter by putting darker values around it. I was just covering all my bases there. So a little bit of the indigo blue showing through in areas is not a big deal. So we can have it dominate in some areas, but if we want the shadowed areas to appear a little bit warmer, a little bit of more of the dark umber will not hurt as well. So especially back here on the back, I want this to appear a little bit warmer. So I'm going to apply a little bit more of the dark umber over the top. And then we'll grab that colorless blender. So we've got the beginnings of the shadow on the back side of the frog here. And as you can imagine, as I continue to work down this way, I'm going to start making these areas a whole lot darker so that we really get the impression that the light source is coming from the upper right-hand corner, and a lot of that shadowed area is back here, which would result from the light source being in that location. Let's see, maybe a little bit more of the dark umber up here. And you should always have fun when you're creating a piece of artwork. I say that all the time in the live streams, but it's very important to remember that, because if you're not having fun, it's going to show in the artwork that you create. You know, if you're kind of looking at what you're creating as a task that you have to do, or you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself to perform, what happens is you kind of stiffen up, and that kind of shows in your drawings and paintings. So have fun, relax. It's only a piece of paper and some art materials that you're putting on the piece of paper. All right, let's add a little bit of colorless blender to this and work some of these values and tones and colors together a little bit to create a little bit more of a smoother appearance like we've got here. This is going to eradicate some of the texture I should say the texture of the paper. It's not going to eradicate the texture that we've created here with the bumpiness on the back of the frog, but it is going to work some of the graininess away. What type of paper am I using here? As I'm just looking up here to look at the questions. This is Canson marker paper. So it's marker paper made by Canson. It's a smooth surface. It's semi-translucent, but it's excellent for this type of combination of media. Thank you there for that comment. Thank you guys. Do you use mineral spirits or stuff like that? If I'm going to use a liquid blender or something of those sorts, I usually use a material called terpenoid, which basically breaks down the binder in the colored pencil even after it's been applied. And of course, terpenoid can be applied with a brush, and it does the same. It does a similar thing as what I'm about to do here with this colorless blender. In most circumstances, I use a colorless blender. The only time I really reach for the terpenoid is if I have a really large area that needs to be blended. Then I can use a brush and cover ground a little bit quicker than with a pencil. Like this. This is a colorless blender. As you can see here, this is a Prismacolor colorless blender. The pencil has no pigment in the end. It's just the waxy binder. So when we apply this, the wax is going to spread over the surface. It's going to mix with some of the pigmentation that's on the surface and work it into the tooth of the paper and create a smoother appearance. It's also going to bring out some of the colors that we've applied. So you might notice that the green might become a little bit more vibrant, that kind of stuff, as we start to work things in here. You can see how soft these pencils are. They sometimes crack a little bit and become brittle. And that's something that a lot of people complain about, but it's really no big deal. You just sharpen them again and keep going. Now, as I'm applying this colorless blender and smoothing out the applications, what's going to happen here is you're going to notice that some of the colors, the contrast decreases a little bit. And that's okay. And you'll also notice that I'm kind of working with a circular stroke with the pencil. And again, that's going to create just an even application. And I'm working around some of the highlights because with some of these dark sections, I could actually pull some of the darker values into the highlights. And that's not necessarily something that I want to do. So I'm kind of being careful there as I'm flattening out these areas. I shouldn't say flattening them out, but it kind of is like that. I'm kind of working the pigment, the material, into the tooth of the paper, as I said before. And as I do that, the graininess of the paper starts to disappear and we have a smoother appearance. You can see here, this is the areas where I've applied the colorless blender. And you can compare that to areas where I haven't yet that appear a little bit rougher. Now, with heavier pressure placed on the pencil, we'll work the material in even a little bit more. So if you have some of those areas that are a little bit pesky and it's hard for you to eradicate that impression of the tooth of the paper, that little bit of texture that appears there, with a little bit more pressure, you can usually eradicate that. But just keep in mind that we are limited on the number of layers of colored pencil applications that we can apply on marker paper because the tooth of the paper isn't very strong. So once you've got to this point and you're applying the colorless blender, you might be able to get away with 1 or 2 more layers, but not many more after that. So I encourage you to build up layers of applications with colored pencils, but you also have to consider the materials and surfaces that you're using and make sure that the application techniques that you're using do kind of jive with the surface that you're working on. So we do have a limited amount of layers that we can apply to the surface, but we want to maximize that. We want to apply as many layers as we possibly can to build up a good bit of depth in the color and make it appear representational. The way we see the world around us, we see lots of different colors, and colors are complex, and they're usually made up of more than one color. So by layering the colors, we kind of create that effect a little bit more naturally. You can see I'm pulling some of those darker values up here on the hump over a little bit to smooth that transition just a bit. And we're almost ready to add these little spots here. And I'll add these spots. We'll make these spots dark before I stop the stream here. So you can see how much contrast works for us. You can see in these areas where we've got the spots how strong they look. And in these areas where we haven't done the spots yet, how different they appear. And it's all due to the contrast and value. As far as colored pencil use goes, I'm going to kind of stop right here with the colorless blender since I'm going to continue this on. I don't want to cover this whole area, so we'll leave this kind of edge right here a little bit rough and grainy until I'm ready to develop those areas. Colored pencils, I think, are probably the most misused medium out there in the world. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they're so readily available. You can get colored pencils anywhere. And a lot of times people's first instinct when they use colored pencils is to draw with them lightly like they would with a graphite pencil, when in reality they're really better suited to be used in a manner where they're built up with multiple layers to create more of a painterly effect like this. Of course, I'm not the type that will tell you that there's one way that to use a material and you should use it that way, and if you don't use it that way then something's wrong with you or you're wrong or something like that. I understand that there are lots of different ways to use materials out there, but I really feel like a lot of people are missing out on the potential of colored pencils for not even trying to use them in this way a lot of times. So I would encourage all of you to try to use colored pencils this way at least once in your life and see if you like them that way. All right, let's go ahead and start addressing some of these little spots that we've kind of lost here. These were built up with various concentrations of different percentages of grays using the marker pencil or using the markers ahead of time. And you can clearly see the grays that we built it up to are not quite as dark as the spots need to be in the end. I mentioned that I want these to have a little bit of more of a cooler feel, so they contrast a little bit more with the shadows in the body of the frog, which for the most part have a warmer feel. They still have a little bit of coolness associated with them, but the browns are dominating. So this time we're going to start with the indigo blue here. And as I'm adding the indigo blue, I'll start with this spot here. There are a couple of highlights that happen in that spot. So I'm going to be careful to avoid those here. And I'll avoid a little bit more space than I think I need too. So I'll leave a little bit more of an open spot within the spot for the highlight. Now, before I add the indigo or the dark umber, I'm going to go ahead and preserve those highlights with a bit of white. Now, the reason why I put the blue down first is because I want those highlights to have a little bit of a bluish feel to them. If you look at the reference, you'll see that there is a little bit more of a bluish feel in those highlights. So we're going to take the white, and what's going to happen is around the edge of where that white meets the indigo blue, we're going to have just a hint of the blue showing through there. And that'll give that highlight a little bit of a cool feeling. It might be hard to see there, but you can kind of see a hint of it. You can see it on these other dark spots where you address the highlights. There is a little bit more of that blue showing through. All right, let's make it nice and dark with the dark umber. And we'll go right over the top of the indigo blue. And as I mentioned before, whatever color you want to dominate, when you're creating a mixture of black like this, put it down first. So we wanted the blue to dominate, so you put the blue down first and the dark umber over the top, and we got a nice dark looking spot that also has some texture. And the reason why it has the texture is because we have the highlights. Let's go ahead and let's do this one, this little one right here. Again, we'll start with indigo blue, and we'll preserve a couple of areas for the highlights. This little spot's a little bit smaller in my drawing than it is in the reference. It does have a nice little highlight there. And then after we've got the indigo blue, we'll go in with the white. You can really see how that white's picking up the blue there a little bit. Hopefully you can see that. Making a cooler highlight, and then the dark umber. And of course, we can kind of carve down that highlight if it's too big, or if it looks strange. You know, sometimes we add things in a drawing and they look strange, even though we're paying attention to the reference. That just happens. All right, let's do a couple of these spots up here, and then we'll stop the stream here. So I'm going to go up here, and again with the indigo blue. Again, working around the highlights. And I'm putting fairly heavy pressure with the indigo blue. Some of these other areas I started with kind of medium to light pressure and slowly built up the application. In this area, I'm starting with a heavier application. Then with the white, and it's usually a good idea to make your highlights a little bit bigger than you think you need them to be. And then that's much bigger than we need them to be. Then I'll go in and kind of carve that back a little bit with the indigo blue here. There we go. And then with the dark umber. Still allowing that blue to dominate. And I'm still putting pretty heavy pressure here with the dark umber, but still, our spot still has a cooler feel associated with it. And we'll go ahead and go a little bit down the back here, just so you can see the contrast. There are a few little subtle highlights here, so we'll preserve those. These are mostly kind of vertical in nature. Then with the white. Just to preserve those highlights. Then we can carve them back a little bit with indigo blue. Make them a little bit smaller, because this is the area where we're starting to get into some shadow. And then the dark umber. There we go. All right, let's do this little spot back here. This is a pretty dark spot, so go ahead and go right on the outside of the, we'll define the outer edge, the outer contour there, and kind of just work our way down. And there's a very, very, very subtle highlight right in the middle. It's super subtle, but I do feel like we need to include it, because without it, we'll just have a really solid dark spot back there, which might look strange. So we'll add that real subtle highlight there with a bit of white. And then it's time for the dark umber. And I know this is a little bit tedious to add one color over the top of the other to create a natural looking black, but it really is worthwhile. If you used a solid black in this area, it just wouldn't look natural. It would stand out. You would see a clear difference between that color and the colors around it. And, you know, you want your drawings to look natural, clearly. All right, back here on this back edge, I feel like it's still a little bit too brownish. So I'm going to go back with the kelp green here just for a second and add a little bit more of a green color to it. This is a little bit of a deviation for what we've done for the other sections, but I just feel like it needs to be a little bit more of a green, not quite so dominated by the brown there. All right, let's zoom out here and take a look at our frog so far and what we did today here on the special YouTube live stream. So you can see the whole focus here was just on building up the texture here. And this is a great texture to look at. Remember, the key to creating the illusion of texture in any drawing or painting really lies in the relationship of values. So we built up the darks and the lights here, and the result was a bumpy texture on the side of the frog. And of course, you can do this any drawing or painting that you create. Just concentrate on the relationships of the values. Of course, the directional strokes are important as well, but the values are exceptionally important as well. And that's really the key to creating the illusion of texture in any drawing or painting. So like I said, we're going to be continuing this tonight as part of our live lesson series at thevirtualinstructor.com. If you want to learn more about our program, which includes these weekly live lessons and our video courses and our weekly critiques, lesson plans for teachers, there's a ton of stuff that we offer, really an overwhelming amount of stuff that we offer. But you can go to thevirtualinstructor.com/members or click on the link below. With that, let me say goodbye to you guys, and we'll just switch out here for a second. So like I said, I hope you enjoyed this little special live stream on YouTube. I don't stream that much on YouTube because I do so much for the members at the Virtual Instructor, and really that's where a lot of my time and attention goes to. But I'm excited to continue this drawing tonight and into next week as well as part of our live lesson series. So thanks for joining me this morning. If you did, again, I didn't send out an email or anything about this morning, and people just show up, which I like to see, which I think is pretty cool. So thanks to all you guys in the chat box. If you do have a question, you can head over to the site, thevirtualinstructor.com. We have a contact form on the site. You can send us an email. There's also lots of places to comment and post questions and things like that over there. We also have a ton of free videos on just about any drawing and painting medium that you can imagine. Not all of the videos that we post on YouTube are clearly posted over at the Virtual Instructor. In fact, we only post probably 25% of the videos that we create on YouTube. So if you only know us through YouTube, head over to thevirtualinstructor.com. There's a ton of stuff waiting for you there. All right, with that, I'm going to sign out. Thank you guys. I hope you guys have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will talk to you sometime in the future. Goodbye, everybody.